Welcome. This is the video lecture on taxes. I'm Professor Cherry. Up till now, we've been focusing on developing the tools and frameworks on how we can analyze markets and market outcomes. This is one of two video lectures that employ those tools that we've been developing to look at a particular issue. The other video lecture was on price controls. This one is on taxes. So in this video lecture, we're going to first go over what taxes are and what their purposes are. Then we're going to define and explain the concept of tax incidence. And then we're going to look at the impacts from a tax using the supply and demand framework. And then we're going to go through a couple examples. So taxes, they have various purposes. One is to provide the coordination mechanism to solve collective action problems. For instance, taxes are used to pay for the roads, government provided infrastructure that without that funding source would never be provided. Right? So people wouldn't voluntarily contribute to a fund to build the roads. Government has to compel people to contribute to these projects. Another is to raise money to pay for things that the markets will not provide. And we'll get to that later when we look at non-market goods and services. And then we also use taxes to provide incentives to encourage and discourage behavior. We often refer to some taxes as sin taxes, and those are the taxes that they place on activities that we wish to discourage. For instance, cigarettes, alcohol. Tax incidence. This is the study of who bears the burden of a tax. So if the government imposes a tax, who pays for that tax is an important consideration in whether that's a good idea or not, or especially when we start considering equity issues and fairness issues. Tax incidence is trying to evaluate who pays for the tax, but also can be used to look at who benefits from the tax. So for instance, does the seller or the buyer pay for the tax? And we're going to go through how we can look at tax incidence and determine who pays for the tax. And of course, this is interesting and important in understanding and assessing policies. So let's look at tax incidence a little bit more in detail. And what we're going to be able to do at this basic level using the basic supply and demand model is look at the tax incidence on the buyer and seller. So who's paying more, the buyer or the seller? Now if you move on in economics, you get to more complicated techniques and models, you can look at specific types of buyers and specific sellers and see who's benefiting and who's paying for it. But right now, we're just looking at two broad categories of market participants, the buyer and the seller. All right, so let's first consider 50% sales tax. What this means is if you buy a can of Coke for $1, it's going to end up costing you $1.50. So you pay $1 for the Coke, and then there's 50% tax, which ends up being 50 cents. So you end up paying $1.50 total. So on the surface, this might appear that this sales tax is being imposed on the buyer, right? So, but not so fast, because the dynamics of the market will shift the burden. So for instance, we can think about the sales tax. If you get a receipt and you buy something, it looks like you have a subtotal amount. In this case, it would be $1. And then you have a tax amount, and that would be the 50 cents. And then you have a total amount, and that's the $1.50. So it looks like you're paying the 50 cents. But the market dynamics, implicit negotiations of the market, will shift that burden of the tax, or that burden of the 50 cents. All right, so what if a tax is applied only to Coke and not to those that buy Pepsi? So it's a Coke tax, 50% tax on Coke, but the buyers could shift over and buy a Pepsi and avoid the tax. What do you think would happen? The seller might lower the price to keep buyers from purchasing the Pepsi, to avoid losing buyers to Pepsi. Right? So they know that if they don't do anything, a lot of buyers are going to stop buying Coke and buy Pepsi. So they're going to respond by lowering their price and, in a sense, eating some of that tax, or taking the burden of some of that tax, sharing the burden with the buyer to try to keep some of those buyers. Right? So they might lower their price to 80 cents from $1. Right? And in doing so, then the tax is still 50%, so it's 40 cents. And that ends up being a total cost of $1.20. So in essence, what's happened is that they've shared the burden of the tax equally. Right? The sellers cut the price, shared some of the burden of the tax, and now they're both paying 20 cents of the 40-cent tax. So now let's look at another example. Now let's say that tax is applied to all liquid drinks. Right? So in this case, the Coke buyers can't just purchase Pepsi to avoid the tax, because if they switch over to Pepsi, they still have to pay for the tax. So in essence, they can't avoid the tax if they're going to buy any drinks. Right now, they might buy fewer drinks, but they can't avoid the tax if they buy a drink. Right? So in this case, the seller might not need to lower the price very much to keep the buyers. Right? They still might worry about losing some buyers because buyers might not buy as much, but they don't have to worry about buyers switching over to another alternative. Right, so in this case, maybe the seller only lowers the price to 96 cents. Right, and then the 50% tax is going to make the final cost 144. Right, so in this case, the seller shares a small portion of the tax burden, but not much. So graphically, let's see what this looks like. Let's first look at the market and remind us what it looks like to have a market without a tax. So we have quantity star, that's the equilibrium quantity, and then we have the equilibrium price at P star. Now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce two terms here, P superscript S and P superscript B, and then T is the tax. All right, so P superscript S is the price the seller receives from that transaction. P superscript B is the price the buyer pays, and the tax is denoted as T. So without a tax, the buyer pays the same price as the seller receives. Right, so that's this graph here. PS equals PB equals P star. Right, so that's the same as what we've had before, but it's just clarifying that the price the buyer pays is the same as the price the seller receives. Because once you introduce a tax, that's no longer going to be the case. The price the buyer pays is going to be different than what the price the seller receives. Right? And if you refer back to the idea of a receipt, you have a subtotal, a tax, and a total. Right? So as a buyer, you're paying the total. You're paying for the subtotal and the tax. The seller, while they receive all of that money, the tax part of that is diverted to the government. Right? So they're only going to get the subtotal. So they get the subtotal, but you're paying the total. And then the difference is the tax, and that's transferred to the government. Right? So that's the concept between the price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives. So what the tax is doing essentially is driving a wedge between what the buyer pays and the seller receives. So how does this look graphically? As the tax gets larger and larger, quantity is going to move to the left. Right? It's going to decrease. And as taxes go up, the price the buyer pays goes up, but also the price the seller receives goes down. Right? And as it goes up and down, they move along the demand and supply curve. Right? There's no shift here because what's changing? Price. And if you remember, price changing leads to a change in quantity demanded and a change in quantity supplied, a movement along the demand and supply curves. Right? So prices go up for the buyers, so they move up the demand curve. Prices go down for the sellers because they start eating and sharing some of the burden of the tax. And the price goes down and you move down the supply curve. Right? And so graphically what you end up with is the price the buyer pays, the price the sellers receive, and it's vertical at the quantity that's going to be produced and purchased. Now the difference between the price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives is the tax itself. So now let's look at the impacts of a tax. After going through that, we can say a few things about what the impact of a tax is. One, it's going to lower the price the sellers receive. The seller is going to share some of the burden of the tax, and that's going to be implicit in that market negotiation that we talked about before. It's also going to raise the price the buyers pay. And then it's also going to lower the quantity produced and purchased. It's going to generate revenue for public services. All right, so those are the 4 results from a tax. All right, so now let's look at the revenue from a tax. Tax revenue equals the tax per unit times the units sold. Essentially, the tax level times the units. So that's represented by this shaded area, which is calculated by simply the tax times quantity. So the difference between price the buyer pays and the price the seller receives times the number of units, Q. So one thing to keep in mind, it's often claimed that taxes discourage economic activity. And this is true. You can see that here. The tax has decreased quantity from Q star to Q superscript T. So this tax has discouraged economic activity in this market. Right? So that's the cost and that's the downside of a tax. But that's only half the story. The other half of the story is that the shaded area that represents the tax revenue, and that tax revenue goes to a different market to encourage activity. It could be supporting education that leads to more productive workforces and so more higher incomes and more activity, or it could go towards research and development. It could go towards infrastructure like roads and technology that enhances productivity and therefore increases economic activity. So the trick is that you have to, whether a tax is a good idea or not, is weighing the benefits and the cost of that tax. And yes, while it discourages economic activity, that's only one side of the equation. That's only the cost side. There's a benefit side as well, and that's what you do with the tax revenue. In weighing those, if the benefits are greater than the cost, then the tax might be a good idea. And if the benefits are not greater than the cost, or the cost are greater than the benefits, then it might be a bad idea. Right? There might be a better policy available. Not necessarily, because even if the benefits and cost are such that the costs are greater than the benefits, there might be other considerations that warrant the tax. For instance, a fairness or equity issue that transcend this idea of just maximizing wealth. The relative elasticity determine tax incidence. Now, if you think back at our example with the Coke and the Pepsi, one of the key determinant in those two examples is how easily the buyer could avoid that tax. If you recall elasticities, that's really what elasticity is. One of the determinants of elasticity was the availability of close substitutes. All right, so if the availability of a close substitute without a tax, then you're going to be more elastic in your demand. Right? You're going to be more responsive to a price change. If you do not have an alternative that allows you to avoid a tax, you're going to be less responsive to the price change. All right, so that example we did illustrates this concept that actually the elasticity of demand and supply affects the relative tax incidence. So more generally, what we're talking about is if demand is relatively more elastic than supply, and another way to say this is supply is more inelastic than demand, then the tax burden is going to fall mostly on the sellers. So think about that for a second. It should make some intuitive sense. If demand is more elastic than supply, that implies that the buyers can more easily avoid that purchase or that transaction than the sellers. Right? So the sellers are more locked into that transaction. They need that transaction much more than the buyers. So that affects the implicit negotiation of the tax or of the tax incidence. Right? So if the buyers can more easily walk away from the transaction, then the sellers are going to do more to keep those buyers. Now let's look at the other case where demand is relatively more inelastic than suppliers. Right? In this case, it's the buyers that need that transaction more than the sellers. Right? So the buyers, they might not have as many alternatives as the sellers. So in this case, the tax burden is going to mostly fall on them, the buyers. Right? Because the seller, they don't feel like they have to bear as much of the burden of the tax, given that the buyers don't have as many places to go. The buyers are more locked in. So essentially what this gets at is the burden of the tax falls on the side of the market that is less elastic. The burden of the tax falls on the side of the market that's less able to adjust to the higher prices. The extent of those differences in elasticities will determine the extent of the tax incidence, or how far the tax burden shifts on one side of the market or the other side of the market. So this clarifies where the tax incidence comes from. It's elasticities. It does not come from how the tax is imposed. Right? So you could have a sales tax, and it looks like it's being imposed on the buyers. But in reality, the market dynamics are going to shift that burden, and it's going to be determined by the elasticities of that market. So let's look at a couple examples. First, we're going to look at cigarette tax. So again, we're going to start with a market without a tax. The price the buyer pays is the same as the price the seller receives. And quantity is at Q star, where the price and demand intersect. So let's impose a tax. And with cigarettes, demand is relatively inelastic. So the buyers are more inelastic than the sellers. So what does that mean? If you recall, that means that the buyers are relatively not responsive to price changes. They're more stuck in that transaction. The smokers, due to the addictive nature of cigarettes, they are more committed to that transaction. They need that transaction more than the sellers. So what happens is that the burden of the tax is going to be shifted onto the buyers. And you can see that graphically. The price the buyer pays goes up by more than the price the seller receives goes down. And that's all driven by elasticities, which is illustrated by the steepness of the demand curve. Right? The demand curve is relatively steep as compared to the supply curve. And that steepness of the demand curve is what causes this graph to illustrate the price the buyer pays goes up by more than the price the seller receives goes down. Now, if you look at it and shade in the area, just to clarify, that the red shaded area represents the tax revenue that the buyers contribute. And the blue area represents the tax revenue that the sellers contribute. So you can see that the buyers end up paying a larger proportion of the tax revenue. All right, so let's look at a luxury tax as a second example. So some policymakers have thought it was a good idea to impose a tax on items such as yachts, private planes, and those big ticket items that only the wealthy could afford. So they impose this luxury tax on those items that doesn't affect middle and low income individuals. But a luxury, by definition, can have a very elastic demand. So let's look at this graphically. We have a case here where the price the buyer pays is the same as the price the seller receives, so there's no tax, and quantity is set by the intersection of supply and demand. Now note here that the demand curve is relatively flat. That illustrates that demand is elastic. It's responsive to the price changes. So you impose a tax in this market. What's going to happen? It's going to be almost the opposite case of the cigarette tax, where demand was relatively inelastic. In this case, it's relatively elastic. It's relatively flat. So what's that going to do is that's going to shift the burden of the tax onto the seller. Right? So the buyer, the price the buyer pays goes up by a little bit, and the price the seller receives goes down by much more. Right? And that's driven, graphically anyway, by the slopes of the supply and demand curve. And let's look at this. If we shade in those two areas, you can see that the buyers pay much less in total tax revenue than the sellers in this case. So this illustrates that the elasticity is what's driving the tax incidence. And that's the end of this video lecture. Do not forget to read your text, review your notes, and revisit parts of this video lecture. And you can feel free to send me emails with your questions. Do not forget to take the quiz.